Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see you. I hope you're all enjoying the conference, seeing some good things. Good. My name is Stephanie Cork, and I am here to talk about dyslexia in the schools. But before we get started, or I share a little bit about me, I would like to find out who I have in the room. And I kind of said this in my previous session, that whenever they ask, like, who's a parent, who's a teacher, I'm always kind of like, both, who has a struggling child, So you can raise your hand more than once with this question. How many of you are here, you're a parent of a struggling child? Anyone in the room?
I'm a parent of a child who did have dyslexia, but I've remediated it with orthodontia.
Nice, yay, that's awesome actually. Okay, and how many of you here you're a teacher? Good, and that includes anyone, even if you, because like I'm a practitioner, and I would, even though I don't work in the school system, I do consider myself to be a teacher. And how many, any administrators here today? Very good, well welcome to, whoops, you know what, I have, I'm click happy. So we got to go back, and I'm giving away my presentation before you even get to see it. And actually now I can move forward. The first thing we're going to talk about is how many students dyslexia actually affects. And you hear a lot of different statistics. We hear as many as 1 in 5. So where does that statistic really come from? And that's something I do want to share with you, is where the 1 in 5 statistic comes from. And 2 places, actually. The first one is from Dr. Sally Shaywitz. In her book, Overcoming Dyslexia, she talks about the Connecticut study, the Connecticut longitudinal study, where they studied children at Yale for years. It was a longitudinal study, and she said, based on her study, as many as 1 in 5 children struggle, whether they're labeled that or not, they struggle severely enough to get the label. Okay, so Dr. Shaywitz is a reading guru out of Yale University, and they use functional MRIs to study the brain and where dyslexia falls in the brain. So she's very well known. Another place the 1 in 5 comes from is a branch of the National Institute of Health, the NICHD. And what they say is, they don't say 1 in 5, but what they say is that 20% of our population struggles with reading so severely that it affects their everyday life. Now think about that. Imagine if you can't read your prescription labels, or your mail, or the computer. It's enough, or you go to the grocery store, you can't read any labels, okay? It's enough to extremely affect your quality of life. And what they really say, it's kind of an arbitrary number, but they say actually 40% of children struggle with reading pretty commonly. And the bottom 20% struggle so severely it can have an impact on their life. Well, 20% in 1 in 5, I know we're not all math people here, but they're the same. So 1 in 5 is 20%. So you have 2 really leading figures giving that number. Now, again, we don't diagnose every child with dyslexia, so it's not as if 1 in 5 children are diagnosed. But we need to think about how that affects our teaching, because if you have a classroom of 25 to 30 kids, you probably have 5 dyslexic kids in your classroom. And if you have, let's say, 100 first graders in your school, you probably have 20 dyslexic first graders. And if you have a school of 500 students, you probably have 100 dyslexic kids at your school. Are those numbers a little more than you would think when you hear it in real life? You hear 1 in 5, but when you actually do the math, it's quite alarming, actually, because most of teachers will tell you they don't feel prepared to be able to teach kids who have dyslexia. So let's actually do the math. If you have your calculator, your phone out, I would like you to figure out how many kids are either in your class or in your school or in your district. And what you will do is you will times that number by 0.2, okay? And that will tell you about how many dyslexic kids are at your school or in your district. So last night, while you guys are I'd like to give a couple examples from the room, but while you're doing that, last night I did a little math on Alabama, okay? Alabama has approximately 149,000 dyslexic kids in your state, okay? So it's something that we can't just reserve for special ed teachers to learn how to remediate dyslexia. We have to, I would say all teachers K to second grade have to have quite a bit of knowledge, maybe not to a certification level. As we talk about recommendations, we would say that a K to second grade classroom teacher would probably need at least, an initial course, a level 1 course in an Orton-Gillingham multi-sensory structured language, structured literacy, whatever term you're using in that approach. So, and then we would say though that interventionists, those that do remediation or intervention, should probably at least go to the practitioner level. That would be the recommendation. So, have anybody done the math? Raise your hand. How many, did you do school or district?
School.
Your school.
So roughly it would be like 85 children.
85 children. Is that more than you thought or less than you thought?
More.
More than you thought. Who else has one? Go ahead.
It would be 1,200 students in my district.
1,200. Is that more than you thought or less than you thought? Or
Well, it would be more than I thought, yeah.
okay. All right. So that's what, the idea of doing this, it's not, a scientific number. We're not saying this is exactly how many dyslexic kids you have in your school or district, but it is eye-opening when you do the math on it and you really factor in. So as I work for a company that travels around and trains teachers in an Orton-Gillingham-based method. We certify teachers, and so we work all over the United States. And when Ohio got their dyslexia law, we would call and say, okay, so now you have to have your teachers trained. So, we would call up a school and say, are you looking to have training? And they would say, well, we only have 4 dyslexic kids in our school. And I thought, you have a school of 20? That's amazing. How lucky are you? So I don't think people really realize it. Now, that was a long time ago. I would say like 5 or 6 years ago. So it changes. But it is, we went out to meet with an administrator at a district really close. I'm from Michigan, the Detroit area. And we went to meet with an administrator, and I want to say they had 16,000 kids in their school. And I can't remember the exact math, and I can't do it in my head really fast, but this district, we have 11 tutoring centers in the area. So not only do we train teachers, but we actually tutor and remediate dyslexia at our centers in Metro Detroit. So this district of like 16,000 was sending some of their dyslexic students, which, I'm trying to change my vocabulary, students with dyslexia, okay, sending some of them to our center. So the district was paying for tutoring or dyslexia remediation. They were outsourcing it, okay? It's a big district. And we kind of pride ourselves on having pretty good schools in that area. So we went out and met with them and said, what about maybe training your teachers so you don't have to outsource and pay, our tutoring actually is rather expensive. And he said, oh, well, if the parents fight enough, it appeases them, so, it's working. And we're like, so in other words, what you're saying to me is, if the parents fight hard enough, you will pay for them to go out of your district to pay for tutoring. But if the child doesn't have a parent who is willing to fight or doesn't even know how to fight for them, they don't get anything through your district. And, we left and we felt very, very disappointed with his decision that it was just easier to appease parents. So, of course, not all schools, not all districts are like that, but I really do believe they have the mindset that we're only talking about a few children. And the other problem with the mindset is, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, is as a dyslexia practitioner, I can't tell you how many times somebody has said to me, well, you only know how to teach dyslexic students. Like I don't know how to teach reading to non-dyslexic students. I want to go, look, we're prepared for some of the worst case scenarios in reading, whether they have cognitive impairments, whether they have autism, whether they have ADHD. We don't limit our centers to kids who just have dyslexia. We will take any struggling reader, whether they've been diagnosed or not. So it's just kind of interesting, the mindset that we're slowly trying to change over time. All right, so what you see up here, I call the reading mastery continuum. And what you have is we find that about 60% of kids can learn to read via most reading programs. If it's phonics-based, about 60% of students, whether you're using Houghton Mifflin or Orton Gillingham, most kids will learn to read pretty successfully. So then at the other end, you have the 20% that is dyslexic, and they need a very specific type of instruction, very multisensory, structured, systematic instruction. But then you have the kids that kind of fall in between, and one thing I've really liked as I listen to the presentations is people talking about dyslexia being on a spectrum, because it really is. You can have, for example, if you have a child that places right here, they don't fully qualify to be diagnosed with dyslexia. That child still needs almost all the same bells and whistles that a dyslexic child needs. And so whether they actually have the diagnosis or not, we have to remember that these kids need something specific. These kids maybe not as specific. But let me ask you this, okay? Think about the students that you work with that don't have dyslexia, okay? If you were to present something to them, some kind of instruction, and you were to say, okay, you have a choice. Would you like to play this very hands-on game, or would you like to do this worksheet? Okay? What are your students probably going to say?
Game.
We're going to do the game, okay? So in other words, these students need the hands-on game and the activities like that. But these kids enjoy that as well, okay? So in other words, what works for these kids does not necessarily work for the dyslexic kids. But what works for dyslexic students, everyone can benefit from. So I would like to start to change the mindset of we're not just trying to teach to these kids, we're going to use those highly effective strategies that work for these kids for all of our students. And that way we're not, so I feel like most programs, most schools base what they're buying on these students right here, okay? What works kind of for everyone. But if we kind of rethink that, we can head off some reading difficulties. So like, for example, this is how it should work. So we started a long time using our program, which was originally for years when I taught it. It was mainly designed for intervention and remediation. When I went out to train, I've been doing this for about 13, 14 years now. And I would go out to train, and it would be mostly special ed teachers, interventionists, and so on. And our goal was to really try to get it into the gen ed classroom as the core phonics piece, or the foundational skills. So finally, it is starting to shift a little more, and we are doing a lot of work with whole schools and whole districts. I've gone in with my coworkers. I might have the kindergarten teachers. My coworker might have the first grade teachers. Another one might have the interventionists, and they all get kind of trained. So we did work with a school in the west side of Michigan. So in Michigan, just so you know, you'll see Michigan people do this all the time, okay? Detroit is over here, because we're the mitten. And the west side of the state. When I went to college, there was a girl from Chicago, and she goes, why is everybody pointing to their hand? I'm like, because, we're the mitten. And I always wonder, do people in Italy go, we're from here, she's from down there? All right, so, now where was I with that? So west side of Michigan, okay, we're working with this district. And it just so happened that this training, I had the kindergarten teachers. And let me tell you, they were not all on board with this when I'm working with them. And it was kind of funny because the first couple days were rough, and then they went back into their school, started using it. By the time I came back, they're like, wow, this works. And I was like, oh, good, whole different group of people, felt like. So anyway, I had the kindergarten teacher, somebody else had the first grade, and so on. So the next year, I came back to do our structures training, which is remediation for 6th grade to adult. Okay, we have a K to 5 and a 6th grade to adult program. And one of the interventionists in there was the first part of the day, she works as a 1st grade interventionist. And the second part of the day, she's kind of like a curriculum coordinator. So she said, she goes, Stephanie, you can't believe this. After using the program, and just like, it's quality Orton Gillingham this would be the same for any real high quality Orton Gillingham. They said, okay, so she goes, my typical caseload in special ed for 1st grade at my school is 16 students. She said, after implementing it last year, my caseload this year was 6, and 4 kids were new to the district. So and one of them came in halfway from the previous year, halfway through kindergarten. So only one child that went all the way through kindergarten with this program ended up getting referred to her. And that's the goal. That's the whole idea, is if you concentrate on the 20 and have all the strategies for essentially the worst case scenario, then these students, that's just much easier to help them with their problems, because they all struggle. And I have a pretty good slide a little bit later to kind of highlight that. All right, so moving on. All right, so yesterday I did add the definition of dyslexia. I think that's important. We did talk about it yesterday. One of the things I really want to highlight is, one thing that really makes me happy over the last 15 years that I've been doing this is I don't hear as much of, well, he doesn't read backwards. Okay, let me tell you. Sure. After doing this for 15 years, I can tell you that I have never once met a child that just reads backwards. Now, I'm not saying there isn't one out there. I would love to meet that child, actually. But most of my students with dyslexia actually could read to some degree. Okay, now some are young and emerging. But what I want to point out here is where it says that it's let's see, where was it? Deficit in the phonological component of language. Okay, so a phoneme is sound. So dyslexia is actually rooted in the sound system. And one thing that I notice with our dyslexic students is they are more likely to confuse their short vowel sounds than they are to even reverse letters, okay? And we do have a lot of students that reverse letters, but it's also usually B's and D's, S and Z's. It's similarly shaped letters. And one thing that we say about that is, let me give you an example, okay? What is this? Okay, good. What is this? All right, how about this and this? Okay, so in other words, I've said to you, no matter how I hold this in any position, it is a phone, right? But all of a sudden they go to kindergarten, 1st grade, and you show them a ball and a stick, and you hold it one way, and they're like, it's a ball and a stick. You're like, no, it's a B. Then you hold it another way, and they're like, it's still a ball and a stick. And you're like, no, it's a D. And you hold it another way, it's a P or a Q. And then we wonder what's wrong with them, and they're like, it's a ball and a stick. You said, no matter how I hold a phone, it's still a phone. So it makes sense that they would reverse some letters. However, we say that's pretty common through the 3rd grade, so it's not really a sign of dyslexia, in our opinion. I mean, combined with other things, it might be a red flag. But typically, like I would say, most of my dyslexic students, kindergarten through to high school, a big issue they had was not mastering their short vowels. Somebody would have said that to me 17 years ago before I started doing this. I would have went, really? Your middle school and high school students? They almost have it worse than the elementary students as far as those short vowels go. So I'm not saying that is a clear-cut sign of dyslexia either. A lot of other kids struggle with that. But I do want you to understand that it's more rooted in the sound system than it would be even in the visual system. But they all go together. And what we have to remember actually is, according to Marianne Wolf, There are about 16, I think it's 17 different regions of the brain we use when we read. So it's more like an orchestra. And you can have a breakdown in any area. And that's why being a knowing how to remediate dyslexia, you learn a Y. You learn how to remediate B's and D's and how to remediate short vowels and any other kind of issue your students might come across. All right, so where does our information come from? I always think that's very important to know where, because you hear all of these studies. And when we think about medical studies, one day it's good to drink coffee every day. The next day it's bad to drink coffee every day. And it's really hard to figure it out. So I know for me, one day, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I had a couple coworkers and some parents all email me because the study came out. And the study said, and it was like in the New York Times, Washington Post, whatever, and it said, dyslexic students just need wider space letters and larger font. And I went, oh no. Because that, I mean, if you struggle with short vowel sounds or sounds, it doesn't matter how big the letters are and how far apart they are, it's not going to help. So when I read that, I was pretty disturbed by it because it just oversimplifies then everybody goes, oh, we just need bigger fonts and we need wider space letters and dyslexia cured. Okay. I wish that were the case. So I dig deeper and I look, where did this study come from? Study was done on 70 children, okay? Don't quote me on this part, but 35 were either from Italy and France, and the other 40 were from the opposite. So 35, let's say, from Italy, 40 from France. Not even English-speaking students, okay? And one thing Dr. Shaywitz will tell you is depending on what language you speak, it'll show up different in the brain. If you learn, for example, in Japanese and in Chinese, they're more ideogram-based languages. Their characters are not based on speech sounds. So where it's almost like they have to learn whole language because our system is based on the alphabetic principle where you've attached the speech sounds. So when they map out the brain of dyslexic and students with dyslexia in other states, or not states, in other countries even, you will see differences in the brain. So again, where the research comes from is really important. So some of our research comes from the National Reading Panel. And who are these people? Who are the National Reading Panel? And basically, the panel was put together based on a congressional mandate. So our Congress said reading is such an important skill, we need to know more about it. And we want you to put together a panel. And they gave that task to the NICHD, which is a branch of the National Institute of Health. Okay? So it's the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And again, that's a branch of the National Institute of Health. So they put together this panel. And the panel consisted of teachers, administrators, researchers, and parents. Okay? And what they did was really actually amazing. They spent 2 years reviewing more than 100,000 studies. Now, some of that was just weeding out certain studies. Okay, only 75 kids, not that one. Okay, big studies, longitudinal studies. So that's one of the first things they did is they reviewed over 100,000 studies. Then, from there, let me go to the next slide. The NICHD has over 40 research sites across the country, okay, that are currently, or at least at the time, studying reading and the brain and all of that. And some of these organizations are very prestigious. You have Yale, that's where Dr. Sally Shaywitz was part of the National Reading Panel. You have Harvard, Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic. So you're talking, again, very prestigious organizations that are doing these studies about dyslexia. So let me go actually back to the slide. This is, in the 60s, they wanted to know how students with learning disabilities learn to read. In the 80s, they were focusing more on how all students learn to read. So when what the National Reading Panel did is they poured through all those previous reports. And then they looked at the studies from the 41 research sites, which covered, again, 42,000 people, about half being good readers and half being struggling readers. So their recommendations are known as the science of teaching reading for a reason. That's why we listen to the National Reading Panel, because it's not a study that was 70 kids that, from outside of the United States. So here's what they found. But unfortunately, their report is a book this thick. It is a major report, not one that I would like to have to write. Okay, but somehow this is what ended up showing up, was this checklist of 5 skills. So in other words, they said, okay, as long as a reading program has phonemic awareness, phonics fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, then you can call it a science-based reading program, okay? I don't think that was ever the National Reading Panel's intention, was for it to be reduced down to a checklist of 5. Now, these 5 things are extremely important. I'm not saying they aren't, but there's so much more to teaching reading than just a checklist of 5 skills. So here's what happened. So the National Reading Panel published their report in the year 2000, gave their recommendations. So in May of 2006, the National Council on Teacher Quality published a report evaluating 223 elementary education required reading courses. So this is in teaching colleges, your required courses for teaching reading, and it came from 72 different institutions. So this is 6 years after the National Reading Panel published their report. These are like teacher training programs, your undergrad. Here's what they found. If I can get to the click. Oh, I don't know what happened. It's missing it. Well, I can tell you what happened to it. Only 15% of those reading programs were found to even mention all 5 components, okay? So that was in 2006. Let's move ahead to 2014. How they updated their report. It jumped to 17% in 2014, okay? So we know where a lot of the problem lies, and that is it's not in teachers not being prepared. I mean, that has happened, but it really comes from our undergrad. How many of you in your undergrad had a college level class on phonics? Raise your hand. Okay, I see 2 hands. Okay, that's pretty common. Okay, I know it was kind of interesting. When I went to school, I did actually have one, but I went through an alternate route. I was in an early childhood program. My best friend at the same school was in the College of Education, and she never had to have a class on phonics her entire time. My mom was going through college at the same time, different university, and was a teacher, not one class on phonics when she did. So it's not, it's not the teacher's fault. We all paid for our college degrees. We all expected to go into that and learn how to come out to teach students. But now, we have to still fix the problem, and how are we going to do that? And one of the ways that it's being done is through legislation, through states, and through districts providing training for their teachers. So if they weren't coming out with it, then the burden kind of falls on the district to provide the training, or the state. All right, so there's a really great article about how to tell when scientifically based reading instruction isn't. Okay, by Louisa Motes. I highly recommend this article. And what she says, so back to the checklist of 5, in many schools and districts, educators responsible for the selection of reading programs and methods use the 5 elements as a checklist. So as long as all 5 appear in the product's marketing materials or packaging, they assume that the product is faithful to science-based reading research. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to look at some of the marketing materials of a couple programs, because if you work in the schools, one of your jobs is to figure out what programs you're going to use, or your administrators, what programs you're going to use. And if the marketing materials all say everything is science-based and they do that, it's hard to really read through that. So as I put some of these up, what I want you to really understand, though, is that I'm not trying to put down any program. So I think we have a fabulous program, Phonics First, but it really is heavy on phonics, decoding, and fluency, and it would have to be supplemented with comprehension. So even though I think our program is wonderful, even wonderful programs need to be supplemented. I don't know of any place that just uses one straight program, one size fits all for everything, or if they do, they probably shouldn't be doing that. Okay, so I want you to understand the intention in doing this is really to be digging deeper. And what we're looking for are these phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. All right, so maybe a different way, though, of looking at that is what you see up here, okay? Instead of just a checklist of 5, the problem is, like, I do know there are programs that all 5, like in one lesson, it'll have phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And that way they can say they are science-based because it's all in one program. But the problem with that is phonological and phonemic awareness skills are kind of the precursor to phonics. So in pre-reading skills, you're teaching phonological awareness skills, letter recognition, and formation. And when you put the phonological awareness skills and the letters together, the sounds and the letters together, that's phonics. So they first learn them kind of separately, and that leads into phonics and decoding, which leads into fluency, which leads into comprehension. In order to understand what you're reading, guess what you need to know how to do first? You need to know how to read. In order to understand it, you need to know how to do it. So I understand people could be looking at that and saying, wait, you have to wait to teach comprehension until they're fluent? And no, you don't. That's not what I'm trying to get across here. But comprehension strategies are best taught when the student can read the text fluently. So in other words, if you're trying to teach students strategies for summarizing or predicting or questioning skills, those skills are best taught when the material you're using is kind of effortless for the student. That way they can focus on the strategies you're trying to teach them. So what do you do when you have the situation where you have a 4th grade boy who is reading at a 2nd grade reading level? And this is what I would recommend. You use 2nd grade reading level material for written comprehension, but you would read 4th grade material orally to the student, because what are they going to get if you read orally to them? Are they going to get vocabulary? Are they going to get the vocabulary a 4th grader should be expected to learn? All right, can you still talk about summarizing if you read to them and predicting and things like that? Absolutely. So it's a combination of both using it through written material and working on comprehension orally, especially if they're struggling. So instead of a checklist, this might be kind of a better way of looking at it. All right, so as I said, we're going to look through some marketing packages next. But before we do that, we're going to look at the phonological awareness section, or the phonemic awareness section in a particular program. So before we do that, we have to talk about what phonological and phonemic awareness. So phonemic awareness is a subcategory of phonological awareness. That's a little broader. A phoneme is an individual sound. So if you're talking about syllables or words, that's a broader category, which is phonological awareness. So that would include rhyming, counting or isolating words in a sentence. It might be isolating syllables, or blending them together. You might say, guess my word, pay, per. When the student says paper, that's blending a syllable together. Or you might segment it apart. You might say paper, and the student goes paper, and they segment it back apart. You have isolating phonemes, beginning sounds, ending sounds, middle sounds, and particularly tied to reading are phoneme blending and segmenting. So you have all of these skills, okay? Now, did you notice me talking about letters at all here? Okay. I would be on separately teaching letter recognition and alphabet skills, but phonological and phonemic awareness is all print. I'm sorry. Scratch that. No print. The opposite of what I just said. Okay, there's no print involved. You're talking about sound. So even, for example, if I'm saying, what is the first sound in, mad, okay? If the student says M, that's not the correct answer. You would say, that's the right letter. What sound does it make? And if the student says then that's correct. The reason that's important is, let's say you give a student a word like, let's do pen, okay? And I have a little bit of an accent probably compared to yours, so you're like, wait, what did she say, pen or pin? Okay, so I say pen, and the student says, you say, what is the middle sound? And the student says E, okay? Again, then what if you said, okay, that's the right letter, what does E say? If the student said I, then it would be incorrect, even though they gave you the correct letter name. On the same token, it could be the opposite. They could give you, if you said pet, and they said I, and you said, well, what sound does it make? And they say then it's a correct answer. So it has, phonological and phonemic awareness really have nothing to do with the letter. It's all about the sound, okay? So now that you got that, let's look at this. Okay, so phonemic awareness in this program. It says, examples of instructional procedures. In writing, that's letters. Right away, that's not phonemic awareness. Now, it does go on. Let children learn to hear and record the sounds in words and notice the sequence of sounds. Sequence of sounds, yes. Children work with letters. Again, not phonemic awareness. That's, you add the letters in, that's phonics. And relate to sounds. We are talking about sounds. Children learn how to make words with magnetic letters. None of this is phonemic awareness. So I'm not saying it's a bad program, but I am saying if this were in the marketing materials, you would have to know, you'd have to supplement it with real phonemic awareness, okay? Now, I happen to know this program, I'm not going to say the name of it, has updated it since then, okay? That's kind of an old one. All right, let's look at another one, for example, phonics. So remember how I just said that phonics is where you bring in the letters and the sounds together? And the National Reading Panel, did they not make it clear that we are supposed to be teaching phonics, right? That was very clear. It was the first one. They didn't even just say any phonics. They actually said explicit and direct, like direct and explicit, systematic and explicit instruction. Okay, so not just any kind. So this one is kind of interesting. I've seen this one float around. It doesn't actually tie to a particular program. It's about word sort. I do often see it. In Michigan, they use a lot of words their way, and I have no issue with word sort or that program when you know where it should be used and in what place. So let me just kind of share the story with you. So my daughter is not dyslexic, but she does really struggle in school for various reasons. She's very ADHD. She's 20 now, and she actually has not graduated school. So when I say she struggled, not academically, it was more like emotionally ADHD. So anyway, with her, at one point, in school, I was getting a little worried about her spelling, because even though reading was fine, when she went into 5th grade, spelling was atrocious. And she was going into middle school, and I was really starting to get worried. So I went in to meet with her teacher, and I said, I would be happy to come in and volunteer and work 1 day a week with your lowest group of spellers. And she was like, wow, that's so nice, but we're getting a new spelling program next week. Mrs. Farkas found one that she really likes, and we're going to use it. And I'm thinking, that's how you found your program? Because I don't even know who Mrs. Farkas is, and why do I care why she likes it? Like, your district didn't research this out? So I went, well, okay, we'll start with the program. So anyway, this note comes home with the new program. And again, it's not tied to Words Their Way. But at the top, it had all the great phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, and all of that. And I'm like, oh, good. And then I keep reading. And it says, of course, we were also taught some reading and spelling rules, such as when two vowels go walking, the first one does the talking. But did you know that this rule, like many others we were taught, holds true less than 50% of the time? Not only do these precepts lack reliability, we learn best by active involvement and practice with the task at hand. Okay, so it goes on to say, it says, research suggests that our brain is a pattern detector rather than an applier of rules. Okay, this is now going against everything I've been trained. And I'm looking at it going, rule? Well, wait. Actually, in the English language, our language is about 80 to 85% phonetic. The problem is we have a lot of patterns. So each individual pattern may not be used 80 to 85% of the time, but it's really only about 15 or 20% of our language that is not phonetic. And teaching the rules is teaching phonics. So this is basically telling you that's not the best way to learn reading. Okay, so again, we really have to dig deeper a little bit, because the top of this said that it had everything: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, and vocabulary. Again, I think word sorts are fantastic. They help reinforce direct systematic phonics instruction. So to me, they're a wonderful tool that would go along with that type of instruction. So most of this was really just, here's what it's, I missed that. But the teaching of rules is not really the best way to help our students learn. I saw that, with my job, and you almost gave me a heart attack by reading that. Okay. So those were recommendations, though, for all. The National Reading Panel is recommendation for all students, not just dyslexic students. So what does the International Dyslexia Association recommend? This was more tied to my first presentation today. This is a quote directly from the IDA. The principles of instruction and content of a multi-sensory structured language program are essential for effective teaching methodologies. That's straight from the IDA. Now, the problem with that a little bit is all the different terms we use. So let me just kind of clarify something. The IDA now uses the term structured literacy, okay? They are the same. Multi-sensory structured language and structured literacy mean the same thing, okay? So yesterday, when you heard that you need Orton-Gillingham training, Orton-Gillingham is the pioneer of the multi-sensory structured language or structured literacy approach. There are other methodologies that are very similar to Orton-Gillingham that also could be accredited as well. So if you've been trained in Orton-Gillingham, that means you've been trained in multi-sensory structured language and in structured literacy. So the reason I say that is sometimes teachers will take our training to make it even more confusing. It's called Phonics First. And then they'll say, Phonics First is really great, but I'm told I need Orton-Gillingham training. And I'm like, it is Orton-Gillingham training. So these terms are, and then yesterday we also heard MSLE. That stands for Multi-Sensory Structured Language Education. So it's the MSL. You're just adding the education at the end. So those terms are all very related. If you've taken Orton-Gillingham, you've already had multi-sensory structured language and structured literacy, been trained in those approaches, okay? So they're saying, though, whatever you call that, it's essential, okay? All right, so what is included? Now, this was a huge part of my presentation earlier. We're only going to highlight a few pieces of this. But these are the common components of what is taught if you are using a multi-sensory structured language approach. And it includes everything from teaching alphabet skills, phonological awareness, handwriting, spelling, phonics, fluency, syllabication strategies for decoding multisyllable words, vocabulary, comprehension, written instruction. So if you are to be certified in multisensory structured language, structured literacy, or Orton-Gillingham, not trained, but certified, okay, even at the lowest level, it means you have to have enough to be able to, as a practitioner, work with students about ages 3 to adult to remediate any of these difficulties. So, okay, so when I was a tutor, I went through the first level of our certification, which was the teaching level or the practitioner level. As I went on into the program, I went on to be certified as an instructor. Okay, so I'm certified, I guess, at 2 rungs up from the bottom, if there's, I think, 4. So do you understand now when somebody would say to me, well, you only know how to teach dyslexic kids? I'd be like, but wait, I know how to do all of this as well. And that's what a certification, in other words, if you go to certification and you're a practitioner and you have a 3-year-old walk in, you need to know what to do with that 3-year-old. And you're probably not going to do Greek and Latin roots with that 3-year-old, okay? And if a 10th grader comes in reading at a first grade reading ability, you need to know how to address that. That student could benefit from morphology, but also probably needs very basic phonics. And you're going to have to do it in a way that it appears more sophisticated, because I have not met too many 10th graders who want to learn from a first or second grade reading program. They just don't want to. So again, the training would include all of this, which I think if every teacher came into their first year of teaching feeling prepared to be able to do this, wow, we all want to be good at our job. We all have a passion for working with students. That's the part that's not missing. We all have that desire, but we do need to be trained to learn how to do this. All right, so this is a sample of, this is IMSLICS, the International Multisensory Structured Language Education Council. They're another accreditation body. So we have the International Dyslexia Association. They recognize all of IMSLICS programs as accredited programs, okay? So IMSLIC, though, has 4 levels, as I said. So the teaching level is equivalent to being a CDP, Certified Dyslexia Practitioner through the IDA. And through IMSLIC, you must have a bachelor's. It's a post-bachelor degree or certificate. Minimum of 45 hours of instruction. Now, if you're looking into different places that provide this, like ours is actually 57 hours. So it's a minimum of 45 hours. They have a 60-hour practicum. You must be observed by like an instructor or someone higher up at least 5 times. And you must do that, you can't do that in under 9 months. It has to take at least 9 months. So then the next level in IMSLIC would be the instructor of teaching level, an additional 45 hours, and so on. Now, the IDA only recognizes the teaching level and the therapy level, which I have to tell you, I'm a little disappointed because this was a lot of work, and I don't get recognized for it. I'm just kidding. You have to know that depending on what accreditation council you go on, and there are 3 main ones. You have IMSLIC, you have the International Dyslexia Association, and then you have the Academy of Orton-Gillingham Practitioner and Educators. The IDA recognizes both IMSLIC and the Orton Academy as being accredited programs as well. So that's a little bit about it. So now let's talk about what states are doing other states are doing for dyslexia. And fortunately, we've had, do I have anyone here that is from any of the grassroots, Decoding Dyslexia, the Alabama Game Changers? Your state is pretty amazing that these grassroots parent groups have come in and really made a difference in your legislation and what you're doing. And the reason I say that is because I'm from Michigan, and we are, wait till you see this, I'll show you the map. It's pretty pathetic. All right, so all of these grassroots organizations are coming in and they're forcing legislation to change, and it really does need to. So I'm really grateful to those groups. Here's the map. According to Decoding Dyslexia, as of last year, only 8 states did not have legislation regarding dyslexia. And look at my Mitten state up here. So very disappointing. As a matter of fact, we just got some potentially exciting new legislation, which says if you're in a district that has over 40,000 children, and there happens to be an IMSLC accredited tutoring center in your district, then you might qualify for some help. And I'm thinking, what kind of law is that? You know, how many districts in like Detroit could really use some help? Detroit schools. Flint, if you've heard the Flint water crisis, they could really use some help. I don't know if they have IMSLC accredited programs in their district, you know, for them to, and it specifies a tutoring program. Why that matters, I'm not really sure. So I do worry as these legislators are making these laws, we don't have a very strong decoding dyslexia in our state, and that's partly why. Okay, so only a few states at the bottom, so you guys, you're doing really well. All right, so let's look at some of the different laws in different states. And now some of these are older, okay, but I want you to get the variety of them. So this is the original New Jersey law. Decoding Dyslexia started out of New Jersey. So they actually have one of the first dyslexia laws. So their law said that certain teachers, okay, what does that mean? Certain teachers. Who? At least 2 hours of professional development a year on dyslexia. Because that's going to help your dyslexic kids. If teachers learn, you know, certain teachers, not even all, need 2 hours a year. Let's look back at certification, okay, of not even close. So then you have Arkansas, okay? Now Arkansas is a real leader actually right now in dyslexia, but they started off way too strong. So the way this started is they wanted, they rolled this out the year before. Okay, they said, in other words, by the next school year, we want a certified dyslexia therapist at interventionist at the therapeutic level serving in, you know, districts no later than the next school year. Okay. The dyslexia therapy program is a 2-year program. Okay, remember back here? 2-year program for the most part, 200 hours. Okay, guess what? There was not at the time one university in the state of Arkansas that offered that program. Now again, other companies can come in and provide that, but like we wanted to look at them and say, you know, if you could just get your teachers here, this would be a wonderful start, okay? So they did actually have to go back and revise their law because it was unattainable. Nobody could, you know, how do you go out of state to do a 2-year program and be ready to come back into your state the next year? Just didn't work. So they had to make a few adjustments. All right, so where you guys stand right now in Alabama is you're implementing screenings for dyslexia, appropriate interventions, access to assistive technology, and accommodations through RTI. And you know what? That is, like they said yesterday, an amazing start. It's not where we need to be down the road, but that is a great start. I wish my state was doing what your state is doing. They've established a Dyslexia Advisory Council, and they've mandated IDA accredited training for teachers to be available. And that's really great because I did look up under IMSLC, and you don't have any universities right now that offer that. That doesn't mean, though, that, like I said, our company will come in for 10 teachers. Will come in and provide training. I know Scottish Rite comes in and provides training here. So take advantage of those. It's wonderful, wonderful training, all of it. Okay, yes?
I just want to make one little
Sure.
correction. As a decoding dyslexia and IDA and all that, so we'll totally take credit if that's wrong on our website. But actually in Alabama, we don't have legislation we have an amendment
Okay.
that came through our State Board of Education. And it's been great, and we're very proud of that in 2015, but we haven't gotten there.
Okay. So this is the goal.
No, we have all that.
You have this, but it's
Yeah,
not
it's not
considered like a
legislation.
law or legislation.
Exactly.
Okay,
We
it's
have
an
safer
addendum.
policy,
Yes.
but we don't have legislation.
Okay. However, we're going to say compared to those other 8 states, you guys have far more in place than most states have. Okay? So, and you even have this wonderful Alabama Dyslexia Resource Guide that you guys put together. I mean, really, your state is, we all wish this had happened 20 years ago, but, it didn't. And none of us, I was not even trained in dyslexia, 20 years ago. So we have to keep giving credit for, we are all moving forward, which is fantastic. So thank you for the clarification on that. All right, so remember how I said that people would say to me, well, you're just trained to teach students with dyslexia? Well, if someone were to ask me, what is it that your dyslexic kids actually do when you're working with them? Where are their problems? What are they struggling with? This is very informal, but this is what I would say my students mainly struggle with. The letter-sound relationship, reversals of similarly shaped letters, sight word recognition, rhyming, letter formation, object naming and word retrieval, decoding multi-syllable words, and spelling. Those would be the top ones that almost all of our dyslexic students struggle with. Now, as we said yesterday, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It can be very different from student to student. But guess what? Guess who else struggles with those things? Non-dyslexic kids. Okay, so the way I just kind of describe this is, let's say you have Johnny, who's struggling with letter sounds and reversals. And you have Susie, who's struggling with sight words and rhyming. And you have Jimmy, who struggles with letter formation and object naming. But then you have Billy, who's struggling with all of these things, and maybe even a little more severely than the other students. So what dyslexia is diagnosed is based on frequency and severity. So yesterday, as they said, there isn't just one test for dyslexia. You have to kind of see to the degree the student is struggling to get that diagnosis. Okay, so it requires a lot of testing. All right, so recognizing dyslexia. Now, take this with a grain of salt. It's a little different in every state, but for most states, it's typically a licensed psychologist that would do the testing. So you wouldn't go to your family practice doctor, even though they consider, you'll hear the schools say, well, it's a medical term, so we don't diagnose. But then the medical community, the medical doctors, your family practice, I don't know anything about dyslexia. That's about reading. Isn't that the school's issue? So it's typically a licensed psychologist that will do the full testing. In some states, like a speech therapist, or they might have certain people that are able, and why have you? Do you happen to know in your state who does?
I'm a speech pathologist, and I do diagnosis.
You can do diagnosis.
Yeah,
Great.
It's in our, the Alabama Resource Guide.
And it's so like the schools are doing a screening, but they're not actually diagnosing. So you have certain people trained to do the test to diagnose dyslexia. Now, again, this is kind of informal when people say, okay, well, what, so let me give you an example of what I'm trying to say. We have those 11 offices at our centers, and for about 10 years I was the director of tutoring, and I was a trainer or an instructor, but I spent most of my time working with talking to the parents, doing informal assessing, and writing up student tutoring plans, and so a lot of my work was done there as a practitioner. And we don't, at our centers, test for dyslexia, okay? We will accept any student who's struggling. We even work in math and ACT prep. But we do specialize in Orton-Gillingham and dyslexia remediation. So anyway, we refer out for formal testing, okay? And we have a whole list of psychologists in our area that provide testing. And you know, before I actually talk about a little bit about the informal testing, I noticed yesterday, let me check the time, there was some questions about testing and things like, you know, I often get questions from parents, should I do it privately or should I just do it in the school, or what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, and it can be different in different states, but you know, I know at least, and this seems to be the way it is in most states, in the schools, and we're not talking about a dyslexia screener, but when they're trying to do testing to refer to special ed, they're testing to determine eligibility, okay? So like in our state, we have, it's pretty pathetic. In order to be eligible for special ed, your child has to fall in the bottom 9th percentile in order to get services, okay? That means you don't get services for your child unless 91% of children in your grade are doing better than your child. You don't qualify. So they're not looking to diagnose anything. They're looking for, do they qualify for these services? And we have to remember, if only the bottom 9%, dyslexia affects up to 20% of kids. So the majority of our kids that are formally diagnosed with dyslexia don't necessarily qualify for any services in our school. And that's really a bummer. That's why we definitely need more services where I am. So I will say, though, that most of the schools do like tier 2 a lot more before they, you know, it's not like we're like, nope, not in the bottom 9th percentile, you must go away. We're not giving you any services. It's not really like that. But usually the psychologists in the schools are testing to determine eligibility. And they may not do a full battery of tests like you would if you were diagnosing dyslexia. And even in diagnosing dyslexia, you know how I said I had a list of all the psychologists in the area? Their tests are they do a lot of the same tests, but like one psychologist, his reports are like an 8-page report. When we go to the hospital system, we have a good hospital system called Beaumont, and their reports are like 20 pages, okay? One of our offices came out of a private psychologist that did testing. Her husband worked at that hospital system, and she said, you don't have a center close enough for me to send students to you. Could you send a tutor to our office and have them tutor right out of our office? And we said, sure. So in 2 years, that became our second largest office, and I oversaw that office, and my joke was every child in that office came with a 50-page psychological report that I would have to read through. So I got very accustomed to reading, even though I don't test for dyslexia, I got very accustomed to reading the reports from the various psychologists in our area that did testing. And what I found is that I could cut through most of it to 4 main areas with the child was diagnosed, and that's where these would be the most common things I would see. They had a deficit in phonological awareness skills. They had a deficit in pseudo-word decoding, a deficit in spelling, and a deficit in reading fluency, especially with accuracy. So that seemed to be a pretty common theme of dyslexic students. So, you know, when I'm training teachers in Michigan and we don't have a screener, I would say these would be red flags. These would be the flags that would determine if they have deficits in these areas that more testing would be needed. You know, I said I do informal testing, and I also kind of want to talk about that for a second, why that's important. So, for example, if a parent goes, let's say, to that the one psychologist that has the 50-page report, they charge about $2,300 for their service. And so you can imagine if they come to me afterwards, so they recommend our tutoring, they come to me, and then I have to tell the parent, I need to do additional testing. And they're like, I just paid $2,300 for extensive testing. What could you possibly have to check? Well, we don't get the actual test. So like it might say your child scored in the 96th percentile in pseudo word decoding, and we go, great, but what letters did he miss? Like that's what I need to know. I need to know what I have to teach. And giving me percentages and overviews in these areas is not going to tell me specifically what to teach. So the way I describe that is, let's say you go to your general doctor, you have a stomach issue, okay? Your doctor is going to run some tests. They're going to try to determine where it's coming from. So let's say they figure out where it's coming from, then he's likely to send you to a specialist who's going to do additional testing to determine what they need to do. So think of it more that way. The psychologists or those that do testing, their job is to determine is it dyslexia or not. But then from there, we need to know what we need to teach. And that's more from an interventionist or teaching standpoint. So it may require even additional testing at that point to determine what skills to teach. All right, so I want to go through a few of these to talk about them a little bit more. And we talked quite a bit about what phonological awareness skills are. So I'd like to go to pseudo words. And yesterday, I remember in one of the presentations, one of the presenters, and I can't remember which one, she was talking about nonsense words and using them and how even one of her coworkers still does not buy into this, okay? And you know what, maybe here's a slightly better way of explaining why this is important. So the ultimate goal in fluency is to be able to read connected text fluently. But there are many steps that are needed prior to that. First, you have to be fluent at the sound level. So if I'm showing you, you instantly know that this says D, okay? From there, you might have to be fluent at the syllable level, okay? In order to read words like Wisconsin, you have to read wis, and you have to read con and sin, okay? So when you think of pseudo words, think of it more at fluency at the syllable level, okay? Some of these aren't real words, but like there's a word extirpate. That means to pull up by the roots. If you can't read pate, even though that's not a real word, you would not be able to read the word extirpate, okay? So what we have to look at these are like they're syllables in a word, and no matter what, if I rearrange them, they will make a different sound, okay? So students have to be, so what pseudo words or nonsense words tell us is if a student can apply the phonetic patterns to an unfamiliar word. Because remember, we go from the stages of learning to read to reading to learn. So in other words, by about 3rd grade, they're expected to know how to do it. And so they should be able to decode unfamiliar words. You know, we have a lot of students at our center that come to us in 3rd through 5th grade. That's a very popular time for kids to come to our centers. And here's, I think, why. A lot of those kids have had excellent compensation strategies that have gotten them through the earlier reading. You know, when you're reading in 1st and 2nd grade, more of the there's a lot more pictures on the page. The words are more in your known vocabulary, so you're familiar. You're able to kind of use the context clues to figure them out. But then it all of a sudden starts to shift to things like photosynthesis and Mesopotamia. And those aren't familiar vocabulary words that we use every day. So you have to, if you're going to read about Mesopotamia, you're going to have to be able to sound out each syllable. So think of pseudo words or nonsense words as getting them comfortable at the syllable level. And from there, we need to go to the word level, to the sentence level, to connected text, okay? So it's all these progressions that we're going to take, okay? So if we want to read extirpate or Constantinople, we would need to be able to read the individual syllables in those words. All right, another one is spelling, okay? Don't ask me why I'm in the right job for me, because I love to analyze spelling tests. So here, I have 2 I'm going to show you, and let me explain these tests, okay? So this, I was checking alphabet skills and letter formation. That's unrelated to the spelling. But what I have is 7 real CVC words, 7 followed by 7 nonsense CVC words. Then I still have CVC words with blends, 7 of them. CVC words with blends, nonsense words, 7 of them, and then some various short vowel spelling rules. So that's the progression we teach in our program. So you have like DGE, TCH, the double S here, okay? Now I know this is kind of hard to see, but let's look at her errors here. We had, the word was rug, she spelled it rag. The word was vet, she spelled it vat. Tag, mub, mab, okay? So here we have A for you, A for E, A for E, A for you, A for you. Do we see a pattern here? Okay. This is, by the way, a 2nd grader with mild dyslexia. This is her I was doing an initial spelling assessment with her. Okay, so does this student have their consonants down pretty well? Except for the spelling rules kind of at the bottom, but the main consonants are pretty good. What is she specifically struggling with? Those short vowels, like I said. And it's not even just short vowels. It's when in doubt, use short A. I'm not really sure. Okay, so we have some activities. Now, I just happen to have E and A here, but where we might say ah, and the student has to go, we say ah. And then we might add a sound to it. At. Ebb could be a nonsense word. If they're older, if you say at, they're going to go AT, it's this one. Okay, but if you say like ebb, then they got to go, it's this one, okay? Then you could do real words, cat. Then you could also do like nonsense words, pem, okay? And what that does is, okay, so we do an activity. This is called a vowel intensive activity that we do. So what this is also about in the schools, what they were doing with this student is pulling her out to read. She was mildly dyslexic. They didn't really recognize the dyslexia. So, and they're like, well, she's actually doing pretty good, you know. So we're just going to pull her out and we're going to have her read more. So they pulled her out for 30 minutes, a couple days a week to read more. A vowel intensive takes about 2 minutes. If you had spent about 2 minutes a day, we probably, which one do you think would have been cleared up faster? Half hour, 3 days a week of reading more, 2 minutes a day of a short vowel intensive, okay? So again, knowing strategies for each and every little thing, it's not about working harder, it's about working smarter with our students. Let's take a look at this one. Again, a good spelling test tells you a lot of information. Same exact test, okay? This is a 5th grade boy. And what you can't see up here is he's got a lot of different kinds of errors. I mean, this one is you have some A for you, but then you have, not only do you have not the DGE spelling, but you wouldn't call it a reversal, but a transposition of the L after the vowel sound instead of before. There's a whole lot going on here. But one thing, there were a couple things that I really noted out of this one. CH for SH, CH for SH. So this student could do the same kind of an activity with CH and SH and would have really benefited from that. Another one here is P for B, P for B, P for B, and P for B, okay? A lot of people might think that's a reversal issue. You're a speech pathologist. What is that? What is P and B usually more related to?
There's voice and voiceless.
Yes, voice and voiceless. Okay, so in other words, the P sound and the B sound are formed in the same part of the mouth. So, like, listen to this. If I say the word splash with a B, listen to this. Splash. So let me say it the real way first. Splash, splash. Do you see how a child could easily confuse those sounds? Because one, you're using vocal cords. So everybody take a second and put your hand on your throat and say the p, p, p sound. You don't feel a vibration. Now say the b, b, b sound. You feel the vibration. So you will see this a lot. And as a practitioner, I wrote up a lot of, for tutoring plans, P and B intensives. This one is, though, more related to the sounds. Another one I did a lot of was F, T, H, and V. Because if I say those sounds, isn't it really hard to tell if you don't see my mouth which one I was saying? Okay, that's essentially, I'm not a speech and language pathologist, but more tied to auditory processing, correct? As opposed to reversals. It's more tied to speech and sounds than it would be, I could do B and D, or P and B reversal all day, and that wouldn't have fixed the issue there. It's more tied to, so you know what, the first thing I asked the dad, has your child had a recent hearing test? Because my first question is, can he hear what I'm saying to him properly? He did have a terrible cold or allergies. So at first I'm like, what is going on here? Is it because he can't hear what I'm saying because of his cold, his head cold? You know, I wanted to know, I had so many questions for the dad. Has he ever had speech therapy? Is there, so just all of that came out of a simple spelling test of only a few words. You get a lot of good information out of it. So go ahead.
The other thing about the voice and voiceless that even complicates it more is like when it's at the end of the word, voice and voiceless, really it's more like, it's the onset, it's some speech signs, and it's the onset, not like hop and hog. We really don't say hop.
Right.
You know, we don't put the voice, but it's hop, it's like with the duration of the vowel, you shorter hop and hog.
I love it when I have speech therapists in my class. I learn so much, and I just love it.
So anyway, it just complicates it even more.
Yeah,
It
it really does. And then you have accents. Let me tell you, it's when I go to training, we do a lot of work in Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, and Alabama, and I get like, can you say that word again? You say that word really funny. And they'll say that to me, and I'll be like, I think you talk funny. But you know what? Here, this is a total little side note, but this is according to PBS, not the International Dyslexia Association or any reading. But where do you think in the United States, according to PBS, the purest American English without an accent is spoken? Anyone want to guess?
Somewhere in the north, like the.
You know, it's funny, when I heard that, I thought, oh, probably out west, because it can't be out east. It's funny, my brother-in-law is from Long Island. He thinks he sounds, so, you know, I come down south, and we yell, you got an accent, no, you got an accent. My brother-in-law thinks he sounds like the newscasters. I'm like, Greg, they clearly don't say water and caw, okay? I got in my caw. They don't say that. No, it is, this is interesting, northern Ohio and Indiana. So South Michigan used to be in there, but we over accentuate our A sound. So we'll say cat, hat, instead of hat, cat. But yeah, so supposedly they send the newscasters, a lot of newscasters, to be trained in Indiana, which I thought was interesting. So when I I do a lot of training in northern Ohio, and I look at them and I go, you ladies are the only ones that can say, I don't have an accent, you have an accent. So all of that even comes into play too when you're teaching, and how you say things, and we drop sounds at the ends of words. There's a lot to it. All right, so that's how spelling often affects the situation. So next we have, let me go back, is reading fluency, particularly accuracy, okay? So we have, one of the assessments I give is called the BRI, Basic Reading Inventory, and it's just a has grade level passages to test fluency and comprehension, has 10 comprehension questions at the end. So one of the second grade passages says, the mouse ran into a hole by the tree. Over the years, I've had a lot of students read it. The moose ran into a hole by the tree. So at the end, there's a comprehension question, why did the mouse run into the hole? Okay? Well, so when the student has read it, the moose, which by the way, I would just really like to see a moose run into a hole by the tree. I think that would be very interesting to see. But anyway, the student, I'll ask the question, so why did the mouse run into the hole? And they look at me like, lady, were you not listening to me read? There's no mouse in this story. And then I feel kind of stupid and I'm like, oh, sorry, I just have to ask the question, next question. But what that does is it comes up and it shows up under comprehension, but that is an accuracy. That is fluency. Fluency is rate and accuracy. And if you're not reading the words accurately, then it can change the whole meaning of the passage and affect the comprehension. Very interesting. This was only in one place I went to, but in one school I was working with some middle school teachers in Ohio, and they said, we were told accuracy didn't really matter. It was really just about rate. And I'm like, yeah, but, and they're like, I think we're rethinking that now. Because it doesn't matter really how fast you read. Now, if you're reading very slowly, you might be spending more of your focus on decoding, and you want it to be more effortless than that. And we have a lot of students that race through their reading, skip through punctuation, they just want to get done with it. They tend to make careless errors. So we don't really want them reading too fast. But really the most important part is the accuracy. If you're not reading words in the text accurately, it can completely change the meaning of the passage. So that's important. Now here's another simulation showing the same thing, except for, I knew this was going to happen. When you go from a PowerPoint to a flash drive, it jumbles things. So in this passage, only 10% of the words are missing or covered out, and it is jumbled, unfortunately. But don't we think of often that a 90% fluency rate is not too bad? 90% is an A. But if I were to say to you, you would only successfully cross the street 90% of the time, then 90% doesn't seem so fabulous. Now, where the word should be crossed out, the first line should read, many strains of blank are already blank, except blank, okay? Did you get anything out of that? So if you were to even just take those out and be able to read 90% of the passage, it is almost impossible to be able to answer the questions at the end. And it's not because a student, it doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. It is simply that they can't decode the words. So a couple things we need to think about is it is not about intelligence, that typically students with dyslexia have average or above average IQ. I have heard, because dyslexia is comorbid, you have dyslexia and ADHD a lot, and you have dyslexia and maybe a working memory issue, that they are starting to diagnose some people with a lower IQ with dyslexia, where before that was just, well, they can't read because they have a low IQ. Not that you could have the two together, okay? Prior knowledge factors in. If you have, whenever I show that passage, there's always like one or two teachers that can answer every question that I ask about it. And then they'll say, well, I was a nurse before this, or my husband's a doctor, or whatever. And they have the background knowledge. But if you don't have that knowledge, it makes it even harder to read. Context clues. Like I said, when they're younger, the words are more in their known vocabulary. They have picture clues and things that can help them. But as they get up into higher level reading, it becomes, how did the context clues help you with that passage? Probably not very well. Pictures, they weren't there. Guessing and skipping, again, only tends to work more when the subject matter is very familiar to the student. So we often teach these strategies to young children. The problem is they stop working. So the better strategy would just to teach them how to decode words. All right, so we have a few minutes left. I just want to quickly highlight a few of the components of multisensory structured language that I think, as I travel around to different schools across the United States, these are the components that I see missing out of more mainstream reading programs. So a lot of them have alphabet, skills in place, some phonological awareness, but particularly, particularly the importance of phoneme blending and segmenting is tied to reading skills. If you we talked in my earlier presentation, we've had students that will see a word, they're reading cat, but they'll go at. And the teacher's going, come on, bring it together. If they can't blend sounds, they're not going to be able to blend when they go to hear, and they're not going to be able to blend when they go to read. Segmenting is tied to spelling. If you can't break a word apart into its individual sounds, that is what you do when you go to spell a word. Okay? Spelling. What I find right now is that I have schools telling me, yeah, we got rid of our spelling program. And I'm like, what, you're just not going to do anything? Like, what do you mean by that? That kind of baffles me. Now, granted, I don't think that giving a child 20 words on Monday and then testing them on Friday is really a proper spelling program. To me, my daughter, the one that was the poor speller, or my only daughter, she could ace a test on Friday. You know, her spelling scores looked fine, but her in one ear and out the other by Monday, you know. And it was one of her teachers, I mean, we would kind of laugh. She goes, I always wanted to learn to play the gator, you know. And one day she read all God's books. And I'm like, wait a minute. Does she mean good books? Or did she mean we read the Bible? I was not really sure what she meant by that, you know. So remember, when we're spelling, we're communicating. And if people don't understand what we're communicating, it's kind of a problem. So spelling is very important. Syllabication strategies are being able to break a word down into multi-syllable words. So again, I'll go through this real quickly. We teach our students a strategy where they find and underline their vowels, draw a bridge, label the consonants on the bridge, and when they find certain patterns, they know where to divide that word. Go on to the next one, draw a bridge, consonants on the bridge. Again, I have that pattern again, VCCV. That's one of the most common patterns in our language. It's not Orton-Gillingham. It's not multi-sensory structured language. These are the rules of the Anglo-Saxon part of our language, okay? It's the strategy is more Orton-Gillingham, how to decode a word. Or syllabicate it. So then they label, they learn about 8 different syllable types in our program. Traditional Orton-Gillingham, I believe, is mostly 6. We add schwa, and we break up vowel pairs into vowel teams and diphthongs. Okay. So the student now, a closed syllable has a short vowel. They will have learned that. So this would be consensus, consensus. So it's just a strategy for teaching them how to break down multi-syllable words. Greek and Latin roots, very important, especially 65% of reading material above a 6th grade level is mainly Greek and Latin root based. And if we look even in the dictionary, about 65% of the words in there are Greek and Latin root based. So phonics is mainly Anglo-Saxon patterns. That's a huge influence. That's our everyday speaking language. But when you're reading middle school and high school and higher level reading material, it's going to have a lot more Greek and Latin root influences or morphology. So it's a great way of teaching a lot of vocabulary in a short amount of time. So here we have the root tele, and tele means far. So if the students all of a sudden start to make connections, oh, a television is vision or seeing something from far away. And a telephone is, phon and phone means sound, so a telephone is listening to something from far away. So in their ACT where they come across SAT, ACT, and they come across a word like telecommunication, they can say, well, I may not know what that is, but I know what communication is, and I know tele means far, so it must have something to do with communication from far away. So, and I find when we teach morphology that my students can't wait to come back and tell me where they saw that root in another class. And to me, that's oh, do you want to give me any kind of a compliment? Don't compliment what I'm wearing or how I look. Tell me you're excited to learn about a Greek and Latin root that I just taught you, and you just made my day. Okay? So then going on, controlled readers, a difference between a leveled and a controlled reader is that the controlled reader only contains the patterns you have directly taught to the student. So these are both first grade leveled reading, but this one, you can see it's color coded, so it only contains, so the blue is the CVC pattern. And some students do fine with leveled readers. Again, that 60% is fine with leveled readers most of the time. But your more dyslexic students are going to need some phonetically controlled readers. All right, and then last, oral language. A lot of schools have great writing programs, but I find this is also a component that tends to be missing, is teaching those oral skills, especially in those early grades. For example, let's say I were to talk about reading comprehension or working on oral language skills. Let's say I read Cinderella to you, okay? So who is the main character in Cinderella? Cinderella. And what did she want to do? Go to the ball. But what was stopping her? Her evil stepmother and stepsisters. So who came in to kind of fix the problem? The fairy godmother. And then what happened at the end? She went to the ball, married the prince, lived happily ever after. So let me get this straight. Cinderella wanted to go to the ball, but her evil stepmother and stepsisters wouldn't let her go. So her fairy godmother stepped in, allowed her to go to the ball where she married the prince, right? What do we call what I just did? A summary. Okay, we certainly can teach that through writing, but couldn't we also, if they can't write or spell all those words, couldn't we have our students practice doing all those skills orally, giving an oral summary, orally predicting? So again, I think that's another area that as I kind of travel around, and again, a lot of this is really truly opinion of what I'm seeing as I go to different states and in different schools and different districts. Okay. All right, so with that, I just want to share with you that if you're trained to remediate dyslexia, it's going to benefit more than just your dyslexic kids, your students with dyslexia. The instruction in a multisensory structured language, structured literacy, Orton-Gillingham program has very short multisensory activities. There's a lot of repetition, and you have structured lesson plans. That's going to work great for your kids with ADHD. The kids who have working memory issues, again, need a lot of continuous review. So the repetition of the drill in there, the dictation in the red words is really going to help. Kids with processing speeds almost need the same thing. Again, that continuous review and repetition that they're going to get through an Orton-Gillingham-based program. And auditory processing, even those vowel intensives, the phonological awareness skills. We have a drill called an auditory drill. And then even, again, separating the sounds as they do their spelling dictation. We have them use their fingers to separate the sound. So so I was talking to an administrator that said, but we have kids with a lot of other challenges besides dyslexia. So do I need to go have them trained in, every little thing? And it's like, no, that would, dyslexia training, remediation training would help a wide variety of students. So because of the time, I'm going to leave you there. I will stay a little longer as I wrap up if you have any questions. But thank you all very much.